You know something? There exists a rather extraordinary phenomenon that certain kinds of people experience. They walk into any space and perceive everything. The unspoken tensions between two friends, the hidden sadness behind a radiant smile. We've been told repeatedly that this constitutes a gift, haven't we? This ability to detect what others fail to see. However, today I want to pose a completely different perspective to you. This sharpened sensitivity, this transparent vision of reality could become the most dangerous thing you'll ever possess. I'm not referring to conventional danger. I'm not talking about physical harm or tangible threats. I'm talking about something far more subtle and devastating. The risk of becoming so conscious that you can no longer be part of that beautiful unconsciousness that allows most people to live in relative tranquility. Have you ever truly observed people at a social gathering? They're participating in a collective game. Everyone knows the rules without anyone ever having explained them. You ask someone how they are, they respond, fine, and both pretend that's a complete answer. You compliment the host, laugh at mediocre jokes, nod with empathy at anecdotes you've heard 1,000 times before. It's a kind of collective pact to remain on the surface, keep everything pleasant, avoid going too deep. But then there's you, the person who sees through everything. You notice the wife who flinches imperceptibly when her husband speaks. You perceive the colleague who's deeply lonely despite being surrounded by friendships. You sense the anxiety coursing through the environment like an invisible current. And here the real danger begins. Because once you perceive these hidden realities, it becomes impossible to stop seeing them. And most worrying, your mere presence becomes a mirror that others cannot bear to contemplate. Let me explain this better. When you see clearly, when you perceive the undercurrents of social interaction, you're essentially pointing out what everyone agreed to ignore. And people don't like this. They really don't like it at all. Not because they're bad people or ignorant, but because your lucidity threatens the very structure that allows them to function daily. Think of it this way. Society is like a theatrical play. Each person has their assigned role. The successful businessman, the devoted mother, the reliable friend. These are roles we understand, masks we put on, and the performance works perfectly as long as everyone stays in character. But you, with your penetrating awareness, are like that spectator who stands up in the middle of the show and shouts. But that's just an actor pretending. Imagine how welcome that makes you feel. The first danger, then, is isolation. And I'm not referring to the ordinary loneliness of not having enough friends. I'm talking about something much deeper. The isolation of living in a completely different reality from everyone around you. You speak a language no one else understands. You observe a world no one else can perceive. And the terrible irony is that the more clearly you perceive, the lonelier you become. I once knew a woman, let's call her Sarah, who possessed this extraordinary ability to read people. She could walk into any place and immediately detect who was authentic and who was acting, who was suffering and who was pretending to be fine, who to trust and who was hiding something. And you know what happened to her? She lost all her close relationships, not from being cruel or constantly judging, but simply because people felt exposed in her presence. They couldn't maintain their comfortable masks around her. Her friends would tell her things like, "You're too intense. You overthink everything. Can't you just relax and have a good time?" But she couldn't, because seeing clearly isn't something you can turn on or off like a switch. It's like asking someone who can hear to simply ignore sounds. Once you develop this capacity for deep perception, it's always there, always operating, always showing you what others prefer to keep hidden. And here arises the second danger. When you perceive the truth of a situation, when you detect what's really happening beneath the surface, you face a terrible decision. Do you speak or remain silent? If you speak, you risk being attacked. And I say this in a completely literal way, though the attack is usually psychological rather than physical. They'll label you negative, overly sensitive, problematic. They'll accuse you of inventing non-existent conflicts, of interpreting malice in innocent situations, of being unable to simply let things flow. But if you choose silence, if you swallow what you observe and pretend not to notice, You begin to disconnect from yourself. Because every time you ignore your own perception, every time you accept someone else's version of reality, knowing it's false, you're essentially telling yourself that your experience isn't trustworthy. And over time, this generates a kind of fracture in your being. One part knows the truth, but another must pretend not to know it. This is a very quiet form of madness. I remember years ago being in a meeting where everyone was congratulating themselves on the excellent progress of a particular project. And I could see with complete clarity that everything was about to collapse. The signs were everywhere. The forced enthusiasm, the evasion of certain topics, the way gazes deflected when difficult questions arose. But when I gently suggested that perhaps we should examine some concerning patterns, I was met with hostility. Not with arguments, mind you, not with reasonable disagreements. Pure defensive hostility. And this brings us to the third danger, the most insidious of all. When you see clearly and others don't want to see, they will frequently direct their anger toward you. Not consciously, perhaps they won't sit down to decide to make you the villain, but unconsciously, automatically, they'll begin to treat you as the problem, as if your perception were creating the difficulties you're simply observing. I call this the shoot the messenger phenomenon. When someone points out that the emperor is naked, the crowd doesn't thank them for the truth. The crowd turns against that person for disturbing the comfortable fiction everyone was enjoying. Your clarity becomes a threat, and threats must be eliminated or controlled. I've witnessed this pattern repeat countless times. The person who sees clearly gets labeled. They're too negative. They create drama. They're unstable. They need to take things easy. They're paranoid. Notice how all these labels have something in common. They all suggest the problem lies with the perceiver, not with what's being perceived. It's a brilliant defensive maneuver, actually. If we can convince you that your perception is distorted, we never have to examine what you're perceiving. But here's what nobody tells you. The fourth danger is perhaps the most devastating of all. When you're constantly absorbing the emotional states and hidden truths of everyone around you, when you're perpetually picking up on the unsaid and the unfelt, you begin to lose track of what actually belongs to you. Your own emotions mix with everyone else's. You enter a room feeling perfectly fine and leave feeling inexplicably anxious, sad, or angry, with no idea whether these feelings are yours or if you simply absorb them from the environment like a sponge absorbs water. This is exhausting beyond all measure. Imagine never knowing for certain which thoughts are yours, never being sure if the emotion you're feeling belongs to you or to the person sitting next to you. It's like trying to hear your own voice in a room full of people talking at the same time. Eventually, you might forget what your own voice sounds like. I've conversed with people who describe this experience, and they frequently say the same thing. I feel like I'm disappearing, like there's less and less of me and more of everyone else. And this isn't poetry. This is a real psychological danger. When the boundaries between self and other become too permeable, when you're absorbing too much without adequate protection, you can actually lose contact with your own center, your own identity. Now you might be thinking, well, all this sounds pretty bleak. Is there no hope for those who see clearly? And here we arrive at something interesting, because the danger I'm describing is only dangerous when it's unconscious, when you don't understand what's happening to you, when you think you're going crazy or that something's wrong with you. But once you understand the game, once you see that true clarity isn't a defect, but a particular type of awareness, everything changes. Not because you stop seeing, but because your relationship with that vision transforms. You begin to realize that you're not obligated to rescue everyone from their unconsciousness. You're not obligated to point out every hidden truth or repair every unrecognized problem. You see, what's truly dangerous isn't seeing itself. It's the compulsion to do something about what you see. The belief that if you perceive a problem, you must solve it. If you sense someone's pain, you must heal it. If you notice a group's dysfunction, you must correct it. This is where the real problem begins, because you're essentially assuming responsibility for things that aren't yours to fix. Let me offer you an image. Imagine you're walking beside a river and you notice the water is murky. You perceive it clearly, while everyone else passing by seems not to notice or care. Now you have a choice. You can throw yourself into the river and try to clean it with your hands, stirring it up even more in your effort, exhausting yourself in an impossible task. Or you can simply observe that the water is murky, perhaps take note that it would be wise to wait before drinking from it, and continue on your way. The water will clear itself when conditions are right. Your frantic agitation won't help. In fact, it will make things worse. This is the wisdom that must accompany clear vision, the understanding that not everything you perceive requires your intervention. But here's the paradox. Once you stop trying to fix everything you see, once you relax and is simply being conscious without the compulsion to change or control, your perception frequently becomes even sharper. And more than that, people begin to feel safer around you, because you're no longer unconsciously demanding that they see what you see or change to accommodate your awareness. Think of it this way. When you meet someone who sees you clearly but doesn't need you to be different, who perceives your struggles without trying to rescue you, who understands your fears without requiring you to face them on their timeline, how does that feel? It feels like freedom, doesn't it? Like you can finally breathe. This is what clear vision can become when properly integrated. Not a weapon you use against others' unconsciousness, but a gift you offer through your presence. You see them completely, and in that seeing you allow them to be exactly as they are. This doesn't mean you approve of everything or pretend problems don't exist. It means you've stopped making their unconsciousness your personal project. I want to be very clear about something. I'm not suggesting you become cold or indifferent. I'm not proposing you stop caring about people or distance yourself from genuine suffering. What I'm suggesting is that there's a difference between compassionate awareness and compulsive fixing, between seeing clearly and making yourself responsible for what you see. The danger of seeing what others don't see doesn't lie in the perception itself, but in what you do with it. If you use it to separate yourself, to feel superior, to justify your isolation, then yes, it becomes dangerous. If you use it to attack others for their blindness, to shame them for not seeing, to punish them for their unconsciousness, then yes, it destroys relationships and leaves you alone. But if you can hold your clarity lightly, if you can see without clinging, perceive without controlling, understand without demanding, then your awareness becomes something entirely different. It transforms into a space in which others gradually awaken at their own pace, in their own time, without being forced, pushed, or judged. This is what I've learned after many years observing people with this capacity for clear vision. Those who suffer most aren't those who see most. They're those who haven't learned to protect themselves while seeing. They're the ones who absorb everything without filtration, who assume every burden they perceive, who exhaust themselves trying to wake a world that isn't ready to wake. Those who thrive, who manage to use their perception without being destroyed by it, have learned something crucial. They've learned to be in the world, but not of it. They can see clearly without being consumed by what they see. They can perceive deeply without losing themselves in others' experiences. They maintain what you might call a conscious distance, not the distance of cold withdrawal, but the distance of healthy boundaries. And how is this learned? It begins with spending time alone, real time. Not just physical solitude, but psychological solitude. Time when you're not absorbing anyone else's emotions, thoughts, or problems. Time when you can settle, like that murky water we talked about, until you can clearly distinguish which feelings are truly yours and which you've been carrying for others. It continues with learning to trust your perception without being controlled by it. Yes, you see that your friend's marriage is in trouble. Yes, you perceive that your colleague is deeply unhappy. Yes, you sense the dysfunction in your family system. All of this may be absolutely true, but the question isn't whether you see correctly. The question is what you're going to do with this information. And sometimes, frequently, actually, the wisest thing you can do is absolutely nothing except hold space for the truth to eventually emerge on its own. This doesn't make you passive or indifferent. It makes you wise because you understand that people change when they're ready to change, not when you need them to change. Problems get solved when conditions are right, not when you've decided it's time to fix them. And consciousness develops at its own pace, which is almost never as fast as you'd like. So here we are at the heart of the matter. The danger of seeing what others don't see is real. It can isolate you, exhaust you, make you a target for others' defensive anger, and cause you to lose touch with your own center. But it doesn't have to be this way. Not if you learn to carry your awareness consciously. Not if you develop the fortitude to see without the compulsion to repair. Not if you can remain true to your perception while allowing others to remain true to their own awakening process. The gift and the curse are the same thing. The question is only whether you'll learn to handle the gift with enough wisdom that it doesn't become a curse. Whether you'll develop the patience, boundaries, and self-knowledge necessary to be clear without being crushed by your own clarity. And perhaps most importantly, whether you'll find others who can see as you see because they exist. You know, other people who live in this peculiar space of perceiving more than most, of sensing the hidden, of knowing the unspoken. When you find these people, when you can finally be fully seen by someone who doesn't need you to be less perceptive to feel comfortable, that's when the danger begins to transform into something beautiful. Because you realize you're not alone after all. You're not crazy. You're not broken. You're simply awake in a world that mostly sleeps. And there are others who are awake too. And together, without force or pressure or urgency, you can hold space for consciousness to gradually expand like dawn, slowly breaking over a sleeping city. This is the hope within the danger, that your clear vision, when held wisely, becomes not a burden you carry alone, but a light you offer to others, gently, patiently, allowing them to approach when they're ready, if they ever are. And if they never are, well, that's their right. Your work isn't to wake them. Your work is simply to remain awake yourself, to keep seeing clearly while learning to live in peace with what you see. The danger is real, but so is the possibility. The possibility that you'll learn to be conscious without being consumed, that you'll see deeply without drowning in what you perceive, that you'll carry your awareness as a gift rather than a curse. And that, my friends, that is the art of living with eyes wide open in a world that prefers to keep them closed.